I absolutely love working in the New South Wales Public Service. Yes, the diversity of roles is enormous. Yes, it is the biggest employer in the Southern Hemisphere. And my experience has been quite extraordinary. I am currently the Executive Director, Regional Development at the Department of Industry, which gives me a wonderful opportunity to travel around the state to promote job creating programs, to work with businesses, to do all sorts of things around employment and regional growth. And it's a wonderful opportunity for me because I have an honours degree in economics and a law degree. And this job seems tailored to my early training and also some of my interests in terms of job creation, infrastructure development and all of those things. But let's put that aside for a moment and talk a bit about how I got here and what my journey to this point was. Going right back, as I said, I did economics and law at Sydney University and I had a career mapped out as a solicitor. And I thought before I did that, as I was an elite athlete, I would try and make national selection as a lightweight rower. And I was well on track to that goal. I won a national title in Tasmania and was looking to represent Australia in the lightweight double scull when unfortunately I had a car accident coming back from a regatta in Taree. Didn't even need to go to that regatta, but I was president of the rowing club and I wanted to see the rest of my club compete at the intermediate championships. And that really demanded a rethink. I worked for a few years in the private sector as a solicitor, and working part-time, coming back from a serious injury, was really tough. It was also a job where all of my peers were doing incredibly solid apprenticeships and working 80-hour weeks, and there was no way at that stage, post-accident, that I was ever going to be able to do that. Fortunately, my background in rowing and my sort of community involvement meant that I was connected with John Coates, who works at the Australian Olympic Committee, and he suggested that I might try and work at the organising committee for the Olympic Games. Now, while that's not the public service strictly, it was a real hybrid of an organisation with lots of public servants and also all sorts of event professionals and emerging event professionals. And I had 6 years there looking after the training venues for the Olympic and Paralympic Games. Along the way, I was asked to be secretary of the Sports Commission at SOCOG, which was the subcommittee of the board that made all the decisions about sport. And I pursued company secretarial training on the basis of that amazing experience, being at that board table where decisions were made and understanding the sort of material that senior leaders need to make big decisions and then making sure that they were implemented. After the Games, I was wondering what I should do, and this is where you come in. I went for a job as a grade 9-10 clerk at the Department of Sport and Recreation. And I won the role. It was a temporary position, but I was, on the way in the public service. And we were out at Sydney Olympic Park and I had a role in grants administration. And I worked on that role for a while, but then I had an excellent manager, and I'm going to name her because I don't think she'd mind, but Wendy Gillett was a fabulous mentor to me and a great leader. And she suggested that I might like to act in a grade 11-12 role in industry development. And I started to have more diverse experiences, from administering the Boxing and Wrestling Control Act and attending the Boxing Authority meetings to administering the Mount Panorama Act and motor racing, to the run-of-the-mill dealing with sporting organisations who are looking to the government for funding for support, which is a very common experience for public servants, for anyone who works in the public service. I was aware though that my role was temporary, and I looked around for something permanent and applied for what was then a senior officer role as company secretary at Sydney Olympic Park Authority. And that was a fabulous role, partly because the chairman there was David Richmond, and David Richmond had run the Olympic Coordination Authority and built all the venues for the Olympic Games and was a career public servant with that enormous experience, someone that you would call a mandarin in the old-fashioned language, which is really a leader in the public service. And he had actually run a program when I was at SOCOG to make sure that venues were wheelchair accessible. And this was policy put into practice, where he actually engaged a collection of people with disabilities to make sure that the venues were wheelchair accessible, but also that when we put them into competition mode, that they worked. And we found out all sorts of inevitable things. For example, the disabled toilets, something of great interest to me, were always being grabbed by the doping control people because they thought it was a fantastic place to wait with an athlete who was quite dehydrated but needed to pee for a urine sample, which is not so great for a queue of workers with disabilities or spectators with disabilities. And so we started to put some of the thinking into place about making sure that in both everyday mode and in competition mode, we were thinking about access requirements, and not just wheelchair, but other disabilities as well. David became a bit of a mentor for me as well, and was a fantastic person to work with, because again, I was seated at a board table seeing some of our fabulous public service leaders making really important decisions based on good evidence and data, and then putting them into practice and reviewing how we implement things. And public servants, it's one of those things that we find very satisfying. It's that policy process of giving things a go, seeing how they work, improving them, reviewing them, and then doing that cycle again and again. So after working at Sydney Olympic Park Authority for a while, I sought a secondment to Business Link in Liverpool. And in that agency, I was required to corporatise the organisation and become company secretary. So drawing on my legal skills, turning something from a pure public service agency into a corporatised identity, and worrying about all the different requirements that would be required for us to fulfil those corporate requirements and also the public service requirements. And it was interesting. It was, however, a very long drive, and I think there were at least 44 sets of traffic lights, and my general physical fitness declined over the period I was working there. And we had some funny workarounds for wheelchair access as well. I think we changed the direction of a door in the toilets on my floor, so I didn't have to go 10 floors to find a bathroom and things like that. But those things happen, along the way. And I found always that other people were very accommodating, and I was able to work through where we mightn't achieve the standard requirements for a person with a disability. We could generally work out something that would work for me. And people were very, very helpful and increasingly thoughtful as I explained what I needed and how we could make things simpler for me. After that, I took a role at Transport Infrastructure Development Corporation, again as company secretary, but this time running corporate services. And this was a really interesting role because as company secretary, I needed to go with our board to rail construction sites. So I decided that, like most of our engineer-dominated workforce, I would do my construction green card. It's a OH&S work health safety sort of requirement card, and I would also do my track safety training. I had to do a medical for that, and I did all the training perfectly successfully, but then they didn't want to give me a card because they said, well, you're not safe on a railway track on your own. And I said, well, the whole point of your training is that I know that I wouldn't be letting myself loose on a railway track on my own. I will actually be complying with instructions, wearing my hard hat and doing what I'm told. So much to my CEO of the Times amusement, I managed to negotiate and get both those cards, and I can put them on my resume now, construction safety and track safety, which I haven't had a great deal of need for in recent years. At that point, I decided to take a bit of a career break. My husband had some melanoma and it didn't look good. As it turned out, it was all fine. But I felt I'd been working very long hours and I should sort of take a break and do some different things. I am never able to resist an opportunity. It's one of the things about my career. So someone said, would you please go on the Combat Sports Authority? We can't find any women with combat sport experience and a legal background and governance. I thought, well, that's fair enough. That's probably quite a hard ask. But all that experience at SOCOG with Taekwondo, the boxing bunch, and all the other martial arts meant that I had a fair idea about those sports, certainly at the amateur level, and some of the politics that's involved as well. And so I nominated for that Combat Sports Authority and very quickly found myself doing things like determine whether boxers in their late 30s should be permitted to keep fighting after the regulated age, and sitting ringside and looking to see if I could see evidence of impairment through head injury and things like that. Well, it was a really, really interesting role, that coalface, applying of legislation, thinking about the safety of individuals and what an authority should do in those instances. And it was a very interesting 2 years. Pretty much the same time, I was asked by sport at Sydney University, where I had been president of the Women's Rowing Club for 24 years. I was asked by sport if I would stand for election to Sydney University Senate, and the Senate is the governing board of the university. So I thought, oh well, I'll give that a go, and I got myself on a pretty funny sort of a ticket with 7 people, which is a bit odd because there are only 5 positions, and one of them was Peter Fitzsimons. So Peter and I were the only 2 elected, and then I found myself really in a very challenging and interesting environment. Sydney University Senate at that time, 22 people around the table, quite parliamentary in its behaviour. People debate and argue. It's not a very corporate board. It is getting more so, but at that stage it was quite parliamentary. And so after a very interesting settling in period, I did the Institute of Company Directors course, resolved that I would try and work out how to be an effective board member by taking other people around that very diverse table with me. I had a fabulous 4 years. And some of the experiences in that role involved being on the Building and Estates Committee at Sydney University, embarked on an enormous building program, and that gave me the opportunity to have input into building design and making sure that things were accessible for people with different disabilities. Thinking as well about the fact that people with disabilities, they like each other, but they would actually like to sit with their friends who aren't disabled. So thinking about giving different seating areas in a lecture theatre for people with disabilities. Thinking about some of the normal bugbears, which is that the wheelchair access is only available in normal building mode between 9 and 5, and you actually can't get in and out because it's only stairs after hours. So all of those challenges. I also had the unique privilege of sitting on a nominations and appointments committee, which nominates people for awards, but also considers the makeup of the Senate and the sort of diversity that should be around that table, because some of the people are government appointments, and you need to think, as we do in the public service, about the different skills that should be, skill sets, knowledge, experience, attributes and capabilities that should be on a board or in a leadership group, to make sure that we get good outcomes, and in those cases, outcomes for the university. Things like choosing a chancellor is not the everyday experience, but that was extraordinarily good experience for me. Needless to say, I was drawn back into the public service and tempted back to Business Link to help out there for a while. And while I was there, the most amazing role dropped into my lap. I had always stayed involved in the Institute of Public Administration, and I would recommend anyone in the public service consider joining the Institute of Public Administration, because their networking events are matchless. You rarely find such a wonderful opportunity to talk to senior public service leaders, because the events are not large and there's often a drinks period afterwards, and it's a chance to chat with people you wouldn't otherwise meet. And it was through that sort of networking that Donna Reigate, then CEO of Office of Communities, asked me to be acting CEO of the New South Wales Institute of Sport. And I had an extraordinary 7-month period there where I was looking after that organisation in a time of crisis. And there were some interesting factors around that. One is that the Deputy Chairman is Alan Jones. So within 2 days of starting in that organisation, I was in his living room in the toaster, explaining what I would be doing and how I would be stabilising the organisation and working with the board to make sure that the outcomes for the athletes were not affected. I was also, on my first evening there, sitting in the office of the CEO, which was a rather grand affair, with Louise Savage, who is someone I greatly admire, also another woman in a wheelchair, and we were both sitting there laughing, thinking, this is amazing that a person in a wheelchair would be in this role. It seemed very unlikely to us in the world of sport, where the CEO from Central Casting is generally a middle-aged man, that a woman in a wheelchair would be sitting in that rather plush white leather office with Foxtel. And Louise is a great person, and I really think that we have some fabulous people, and she is one of the public servants that I greatly admire with a disability. Now, I won't speak for too much longer, but since then I've looked after the Centenary of Anzac program, And while I was doing that, I really started to take a little bit of a stock take of my career and think, what could I actually achieve? What would I like to do? And as part of that process, I thought carefully about all of the public servant experiences I had, which I had greatly enjoyed. And I really reflected on all of those, and I thought about the things that I had done in each of those roles or examples or instances, and I actually wrote them all down. And then I thought of all the things I had done in the public service that I didn't like. I wrote them down. And I looked at those different situations, and on that basis I thought about the sort of job that I liked on the basis of the good experiences that I'd had. And those things that had been great experiences became the case studies I pulled out in job interviews, because I was able to very naturally talk about those examples and instances when I was acting CEO at the New South Wales Institute of Sport, when I was a clerk grade 9-10 looking after grants. I particularly enjoyed this challenge, this is how I did it. And they became the examples I used in interviews, and they also helped in the great job seeking process, which is a matchmaking process really. You know, sometimes you think, if I get an offer, that'll be fantastic. But by the time you get to the offer stage, it's really good to be in a position where you've been in an interview, you've been fairly confident about answering the questions, and you've asked some questions yourself. So you've made sure that it's a role where you personally will shine, because there's no point taking on a real back office role where you'll be doing lots of work with paper if you're really quite gregarious and you get your energy levels from working with people. So you really need to think as you approach a job seeking process, what do I like? Where am I good? What are the experiences I've had, school, work or wherever, where I've felt confident? Because that is where you will shine, and that is where you'll be happy and you will do your best work. There's no point taking a job, even if it's offered to you and it all, you know, seems to fit, if you're not going to be happy there, because you won't succeed. So I was thinking about my career. And I went along, it was my aunt who's been one of my mentors, and she had been a senior public servant herself, and she said, look, you need to go and talk to Corn Ferry, you need to start talking to people. You've got to get on with it. If you're going to have a serious career in the public service, you really need to give it a bit of a go. Go and just have a chat. So I had a chat at Corn Ferry, and I think they looked at my resume and they thought it was a laundry list. It was 5 densely packed pages with every experience that I've ever had on it. Not exactly salesman material, the sort of thing I look at now and think, goodness me, oh, wow, there must be gold in here, but I'm going to need a magnifying glass and a long time to read it. And they got me a bit of a coach, helped me clean up my resume, think about all of those experiences, and then I was asked if I might apply for a role at the Department of Industry. And I thought, oh well, they're making up the numbers, you know, here they are, they need to put a few people on the table and make sure that they're doing their work. And much to my amazement, after a very good discussion in an interview where I put all of those things into practice, I had those great examples on the table of things where I'd shone, they said, offered me a job, Executive Director at the Department of Industry. And I knew, because I'd gone through that process pretty thoroughly, I'd had a good discussion in the interview, I'd asked them the questions I wanted to know about whether it was going to suit my particular needs, that it was going to be a good fit for me. And while things have changed a lot in the 18 months I've been in the role because of machinery of government and restructure and all of those things, I've come through the process pretty well, and my role has grown over the 18 months that I've been at the department. So it's been a really good fit for me. So I'm wishing you all well. I'm hoping that some of the things I've said today resonate with you. That you think about the good experiences you've had and you look for work that really suits your capabilities. Look for a job where you'll bring all your talents and attributes to the table, and you will really enjoy and make a very big contribution to the New South Wales Public Service, because it's a great place to work and there's a lot of great people in it, and I'm hoping that you find the right role for all of you. Thank you.